Good morning, students. Today is Tuesday, 13 April 2021. Our exam is 4 weeks from today. It's on the 11th of May, so make sure you get that on your calendar. 4 weeks. I would like you to add a little something to the reading. The reading list contains all but the final section of Chapter 7 on Kant. And I would like you to add the final short section. It's only 4 pages long. And in that section, Feldman discusses some additional examples. In fact, he calls that section more examples. And since I've incorporated a couple of his examples on this handout, and since I want to go over the whole handout, I'm going to ask you to read those 4 pages, and we'll discuss them 2 days from now when we finish up this chapter. Okay, so I'm asking you to read the final section of Chapter 7 as well as all of the other sections. So in effect, you're going to be reading the whole chapter, Chapter 7. Today is the 3rd day of 4 on Chapter 7. So when we meet again 2 days from now, probably on Thursday, we will finish up the chapter. And that means that next week we will devote both days to Chapter 8. Now, I'm skipping most of Chapter 8. We're going to cover the first section, and I'm going to post some supplemental reading for you, and I will lecture on that supplemental reading. So next week, we will have 2 more days on Kant. That will leave 3 days remaining in the semester, and we will devote all 3 of those days to the final theory by David Ross. It's called Rossian pluralism. Okay, so that's where things are going. Now let me go over the handouts that are posted. This handout should be familiar. We've already talked about it. It's a flow chart that helps you understand Kant's theory, the categorical imperative. And we're going to go over that a little bit more in a moment. This handout is fairly new. It's copied on both sides of my paper. You can see it's got an image of Kant on it. And what I did is I typed up the 4 examples directly from Kant's book. Since Feldman quotes only a little bit, I thought it would be useful to have the whole quotation. And we're going to read these paragraphs today when we go over Kant's examples. The third handout that's been posted now for some time is a diagram that I made for you showing each of the cases that Feldman discusses, not only Kant's 4 examples, but additional examples from the final section of the chapter. Okay, so we've got 3 handouts. The purpose of these handouts is to help you understand Kant's theory. So you'll be tested on the readings, that is to say the book. You'll be tested on my videotape lectures, and you'll be tested on all of the handouts that I post on Canvas for you. So you need to try to assimilate and synthesize everything for purposes of studying for the exam. So let's begin today with something from the previous section that we didn't talk about yet. You may have thought of the golden rule when we were discussing Kant's theory, because there are some similarities. Now, the golden rule, which appears not only in Christianity, but in many other world religions, the golden rule has been formulated in different ways. It's been formulated in a positive way and in a negative way. Here is how Feldman puts it in the negative way. On page 105, Feldman writes, "An act is morally right if and only if, in performing it, the agent refrains from treating others in ways in which he would not want the others to treat him." Unquote. So that's one of many possible formulations of the golden rule, and it happens to be a negative formulation. You could have formulated it in a positive way, something like this: "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," which says the following: once you understand how you want to be treated by others, you should treat other people that way. Okay? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. A negative formulation would be, do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. Okay, so those are various formulations of the golden rule. Now, it sounds as though it has a lot in common with Kant's theory, Kant's categorical imperative. But in fact, in his little book, Kant says his theory is not the same as the golden rule, and he tries to explain why. Now, Feldman explains it as follows. Feldman says that whenever a particular person doesn't mind being mistreated, he or she will be able to prescribe that others be treated in that way. And Kant would not allow that. For example, suppose you are a masochist. Suppose you don't mind having pain inflicted on you. Maybe you even desire it and enjoy it. Okay, that's what a masochist is. So if you apply the golden rule to that, the golden rule says don't treat other people in a way you wouldn't want to be treated. Since you personally, being a masochist, don't mind having pain inflicted, that would allow you to inflict pain on other people. So if you are a masochist, you would be entitled under the golden rule to inflict pain on others. Now, Kant would never allow that. Kant would never allow you to mistreat others. Even if you don't mind being mistreated, that still, according to Kant, does not license you or allow you to mistreat other people. Okay? And the same would go for someone who is willing to be self-sufficient. Imagine someone who wants to be self-sufficient and does not want any assistance from other people. Okay? According to the golden rule, you are therefore allowed not to help other people because you don't mind not being helped, therefore you don't help others. But Kant would not allow that. Kant would insist that even if you don't mind being left to your own resources, you still have a duty to help other people. Okay, so my point is, don't confuse Kant's theory, which he called the categorical imperative. Don't confuse it with the golden rule. They may sound alike, but they are not the same. They have different implications in certain cases, like the masochist or the rugged individualist. All right, so enough about the golden rule. Let's turn to the section of the book entitled Kant's Four Examples. Kant, in support of his theory, or what I'm calling a theory, he didn't call it that. He called it the supreme principle of morality, and he gave it the name the categorical imperative. But I'm going to call it a theory because it looks as though Kant intended for this theory or principle to be a competitor to theories like utilitarianism. And since we call them theories, I'm going to call Kant's principle a theory as well. What Kant tried to do in this part of his book is give some examples and show that his theory gives the right result. In other words, he wants to show that his theory classifies these acts properly. Acts that seem to be wrong come out wrong on his theory. Acts that seem to be right come out right on his theory. So one way to support a theory is to show that it consistently gives intuitively correct results. And Kant thought that his theory did this. In fact, it's interesting that Kant thought that his theory was just common sense. He didn't think it was particularly radical at all. It wasn't designed to change our beliefs about right and wrong. It was designed to provide a foundation for beliefs that we already have. So let me quote a couple of philosophers who have studied Kant very carefully and come to the conclusion that Kant saw his theory as simply reporting and undergirding common sense. Here is Jerome Schneewind. You don't need to remember his name. In fact, you don't even need to remember the quotation I'm about to give you. Just listen carefully. According to Schneewind, Kant thought the principle he proposed as fundamental to morality simply articulates what all people have always known, and that it would lead to judgments matching those which common sense would make spontaneously, unquote. So that's Jerome Schneewind, a prominent philosopher who has studied Kant carefully, and he has come to the conclusion that Kant thought his theory was simply explaining and illustrating beliefs that we already have about right and wrong. Here is another philosopher, David Ross, and we're going to be looking at Ross's own theory later in the course. But Ross was a student of Kant, not literally a student, but someone who has studied Kant's writings carefully. And Ross wrote the following: "It is one of Kant's most constant claims that his theory is in accordance with plain men's thoughts about moral questions." So it looks as though Kant meant nothing radical at all by this theory of his. He simply thought that the theory was explaining what we already believe in common sense or intuitively. Okay, now Kant's four examples all end up showing that the act in question is wrong. He came up with four examples, and all four of them, the act is wrong intuitively, and it turns out to be wrong according to Kant's theory. And Kant draws the conclusion from that these four examples support his theory. In other words, the theory is correctly predicting the results. Just like a scientific theory that predicts what happens is to that extent a good theory, a moral theory should give results that conform to our intuitions. And Kant thought that his theory did that. Now, the four examples that Kant gives are different in a couple of ways. And this is important because Kant wanted to give many different kinds of examples and show that his theory can handle them. In spite of their diversity, his theory gives the correct result. So let me carefully explain to you the two distinctions that Kant is going to bring to bear on these examples, or in these examples. The first distinction Kant draws is between a perfect duty and an imperfect duty. Perfect and imperfect. According to Kant, it's widely acknowledged that there are duties of both types. So what's the difference? A perfect duty, according to Kant, and here I'm going to quote from Feldman, a perfect duty is, quote, and I'm quoting from page 106 of Feldman, a perfect duty is, quote, a duty which admits of no exception in the interest of inclination. So a perfect duty is a duty with no exceptions. It's a duty to do something or refrain from doing something, no ifs, ands, or buts, no exceptions. The first two of Kant's four examples are of this type. The first two examples are of perfect duties, duties that allow of no exception. So what's an imperfect duty? An imperfect duty is a duty that does allow exceptions for inclination. In other words, it takes into account the agent's desires or inclinations, and it doesn't impose a great demand on you. Sometimes you can avoid an imperfect duty, right? Or sometimes you get some discretion as to how the imperfect duty is carried out. Kant's third and fourth examples are of this type. So let's review. Kant gives four examples. We're going to discuss them in the same order in which he discusses them. In the first example, it's a perfect duty. In the second example, it's also a perfect duty. In the third example, it's an imperfect duty. And in the fourth example, it's an imperfect duty. So two of each. We're going to cover the two perfect duties today. Thursday, when we meet again, we'll cover the two imperfect duties. So that's what the distinction is all about. And now you can see how his four examples match up with those terms. Okay, I said there were two distinctions that Kant makes. The second distinction is probably easier for you to grasp. It's the distinction between duties to oneself and duties to others. Now, it may sound strange to you that people could have moral duties to themselves, but it wasn't at all strange to Kant and to many others. They simply took it for granted that we have duties to ourselves. There are things we shouldn't do to ourselves, morally speaking, harming ourselves in various ways, for example. So Kant distinguished between the duties that we have to ourselves and the duties that we have to others, other people. And those are the only names he gave to them: duties to self and duties to others. Now, the two distinctions that we have just discussed, perfect and imperfect, duties to self, duties to others, those two distinctions cross over one another. So I'd like to explain it like this. Here is the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Here is the distinction between duties to self and duties to others. And when these two distinctions cross over, you get four combinations. And you could, if you wanted to, represent them in a diagram. So let me explain to you. In fact, let me show you my diagram. Maybe you can see it in the video, and then I'll talk more about it. I'm going to put it up close. See that diagram up there? You can see that on the left side, in the left column, I have the word duties, and down below it, I have the words perfect and imperfect. So that's the first distinction that we just drew. Now, across the top, in the top line or row, you can see that I wrote to self and to others, because that's the second distinction. And when you cross these two distinctions over one another, you get four cells or categories. And I've numbered them. I hope you can see my numerals: 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let me get this up a little closer. You see where I have inside one of the cells, I have 1 period suicide. That's where Kant's suicide example goes. And you can see that it is a perfect duty to self. So Kant's first example illustrates a perfect duty to oneself. And as you can guess, it's a duty not to kill yourself. It's a duty to refrain from killing yourself or committing suicide. Now slide over in that same row, you'll see the numeral 2 followed by a period and then the words lying promise. Okay? That is Kant's second example, and it is a perfect duty to others. So what Kant is saying there in his second example is that each of us has a perfect duty to others not to make lying promises to them. Okay, go down to the next row, over to the left. You'll see numeral 3, and I wrote in there rusting talents. Rusting means letting your talents rust, or simply not developing your talents. Kant believed that each of us has a duty to ourselves to develop our talents, or at least some of our talents. And that duty, he says, is an imperfect duty to oneself. And finally, you'll see, if you slide over to the right, you'll see numeral 4, and I wrote the word charity. This is Kant's fourth example. It is an imperfect duty to others. In Kant's view, each of us has a duty to love others. That's what the word charity means, literally. It comes from the Latin word caritas, which means love. So when you perform a charitable act, you're doing so out of love. Your motive is love for the one you're helping. And we can call that charity. So Kant believed and argued that each of us has a duty, an imperfect duty, to benefit others, to do things that are for the good of other people. Now, why are the third and fourth examples imperfect? And we're going to talk more about this on Thursday when we discuss these examples. But in case you're wondering, I want to give you the basic idea now. According to Kant, we have an imperfect duty to develop our own talents. And the reason that that's not a strict duty or a perfect duty is that each of us get discretion, some amount of discretion in determining which talents we develop, if we have more than one, and how we develop them, and how quickly or slowly we develop them. So according to Kant, this particular duty, this duty not to let our talents rust, is imperfect. It's still a duty. Don't ever think it's not a duty. It's just that we get to decide the various ways in which that duty is carried out or fulfilled. And the same is true for the duty of charity. Each of us has a duty of charity, but each of us gets to decide how to carry it out or execute it or fulfill it. For example, whom do I help? There are lots of people in the world who are worse off than I am, and I could help any of them, maybe several of them. Whom do I help? If I can't help all, how do I select those I'm going to help? That's up to me. How do I help them? Not whom do I help, but how do I help them? Do I give them money? Do I deliver food? Do I make shelter available to them free of charge or at a reduced rate? Do I spend time with them? Do I go out into the field and help them till their fields or their gardens? So there are a lot of ways you can help other people, and there may be others than those I just listed. And in Kant's view, you get to decide how you help others. As long as you're helping others, you are fulfilling your duty to them. But how you fulfill it exactly, that's a matter of discretion or inclination, as Kant likes to say. Okay? If you're inclined to give money, then you may do so. Right? If that's a matter of inclination. Okay, so that's what we might call a taxonomy of duties. That little diagram, which I just showed you and described to you, is a taxonomy of Kantian duties. And it shows you that there are duties of 4 types. There are perfect duties to self, there are perfect duties to others, there are imperfect duties to self, and there are imperfect duties to others. And what Kant set out to do is to pick one example from each of those 4 categories and show, or even prove, that the categorical imperative produces the correct result in that case. Kant believed that, according to common sense, all 4 of these acts are wrong. Committing suicide, making a lying promise, failing to develop your talents, and failing to give to charity. Kant thought that common sense shows that all of those acts are wrong. And guess what? He applied his theory to those acts, and he reached the result that those acts are wrong. Okay, so Kant thought that he was actually supporting his theory with these 4 examples. He's giving, his theory is making correct predictions, if you will, the way a scientific theory does. Okay, are you ready to get started with the more detailed discussion of each of the 4 examples? We're going to do 2 of them today, suicide and lying promises. And then on Thursday, we'll finish up with the rusting talents and charity examples. And then we'll take up a couple of additional examples from the final section of the chapter, which I've only today asked you to read. So let's get started with a quick review. I'm getting my flowchart back out, and I just want to remind you of how you approach a problem in Kant's manner. Okay, so take a look at this example. We're going to start over here on the left and work our way in this direction. The first question you should ask yourself, if you're trying to think like a Kantian, or if you're trying to apply Kant's theory, is you formulate an act in your mind, but before you perform it, you should analyze it to see whether it's correct, whether it's the right thing to do. And the first question you always ask is this one on the far left of the flowchart. Let's read it together. Is the generalized form of the maxim of the act the act I'm thinking of performing, capable of being a universal law. Okay? First, you have to state the maxim of the act, and we went over how to do that the other day. For example, suppose I'm tired and I'm thinking of taking a nap or going to sleep. The maxim of my act will be something like, whenever I am tired, I shall sleep. Okay? The maxim is the subjective principle of volition. It's the situation you take yourself to be in. Or if you will, you can think of it as the motive for the action. Okay? The second thing you must do after you formulate the maxim of your act is generalize it. And that's easy to remember because all you're doing is making your maxim applicable to others. So instead of saying, whenever I'm tired, I shall sleep, the generalized form would be, whenever anyone is tired, he or she shall sleep. Okay, so that's just a review of what a maxim is and how to generalize a maxim. So once again, if you're thinking of performing a particular act, you need to formulate the maxim, formulate the generalized form, and then ask the following question. Is the generalized form of the maxim of the act capable of being a universal law? So you have to ask yourself, suppose that generalized maxim were a universal law. Could it be? Would there be a contradiction in it being a universal law or not? In other words, is the answer to this first question yes or no? Suppose the answer is no. Suppose the generalized form of the maxim cannot be a universal law of nature. Then if you look at the box where we have moved the no answer, then we know immediately that the act is wrong. What makes the act wrong is that it cannot be a universal law. That all by itself makes the act wrong. Kant's first two examples fall into this category: committing suicide and making a lying promise. And you can see I've written them in that box. Okay, you still with me? What if the answer to the first question is yes? In other words, what if we end up here? What if the generalized form of the maxim of the act can actually be a law of nature without any contradiction? Now we must ask a second question, and here it is. Can the agent, that means you, the one who's thinking of performing the act, can you, the agent, consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of your act be a universal law? Now that's a mouthful. And if you want, you can abbreviate it just by asking, is the maxim of your act universalizable? To say that a maxim is universalizable is to say that it's capable of being universalized. Just as saying that a mountain is climbable is to say that that mountain is capable of being climbed, to say that a maxim is universalizable is to say that it's capable of being universalized. And what does that mean? That means that the generalized form of that maxim can be consistently willed by you, the agent, to be a law of nature, a universal law. Okay, so that is a yes or no question. And if the answer is yes, you end up here. If the answer is no, you end up here. So let's take them one at a time. What if the answer is no? What if you cannot consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of your act be a universal law? Then the act is wrong. Just as before, the act is wrong. But notice, this time it's wrong for a different reason. In the first case, the act came out wrong because the maxim, the generalized form of the maxim, cannot be a universal law. Now the act comes out wrong because even though the act can be a universal law, you cannot consistently will that it be a universal law. So we've gotten the same answer twice, that the act is wrong. But as you now can see, we got the same answer for two different reasons. And you'll notice that I wrote Kant's third and fourth examples in that box: letting your talents rust and refraining from giving to charity. Okay, Kant thinks his third and fourth examples end up right there. Finally, what if the answer to the second question is yes? We end up in this box. What if both questions get answered yes? The maxim can be a universal law, and you can consistently will that it be a universal law. In that case, you end up here, and the act is right. The act is in accordance with duty. That's how Kant would put it. But we can just say it's right. It's permissible. It accords with or conforms to your duty. It does not go against your duty. It's not contrary to duty. Okay? It's in accordance with duty. And if you want an example of that, it's one that Kant does not discuss. In fact, Kant doesn't give any examples of a right act. He just gives 4 examples of wrong acts. So all you have to do is ask yourself, is imagine an act where both answers would be yes. And I gave an example here: borrowing money with the intention of repaying it. Okay? There's nothing wrong with that. If you believe that you can repay the money, you can approach someone and say, if you give me a sum of money now, I will, 1 week from now, repay you the money and perhaps a little bit of interest to make it worthwhile for the lender. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. Kant would have no objection to somebody doing that. He would say that's a permissible act. It's in accordance with duty. Okay, so that's just an example I came up with to show you what a right act would look like. And presumably there are lots and lots of right acts. So don't assume that because I just listed one example that there are very few of these. In fact, there are very many of them. Okay, I'm about done going over this handout now. We've gone over it twice, and I hope it's understandable to you. The purpose of it primarily is to show you that Kant's theory is twofold. There are 2 different questions that are being asked by the agent. One of them has to do with whether the maxim can be a law of nature without contradiction. The second question has to do with whether the agent can will that it be a law of nature. And since there are 2 questions, there are 4 possible answers. They could both be answered yes. They could both be answered no. The first one could be answered no, and the second one yes. The second one could be answered no, and the first one yes. So 2 different questions, and only if they both get answered yes is the act right. And that means there are 2 ways for an act to be wrong. 2 different ways to act contrary to duty. So let's now turn to Kant's actual words. Get this handout out if you would, and we're going to read a little bit of it together. Now, I think I'll go ahead and read the introductory paragraphs before we get to the examples. In part, it repeats things I've already said today, but there are some additional matters in there as well. So here we go. This is from Kant's little book. Remember, he wrote that book in German, so this has had to be translated from German to English. I don't know German, so I'm not in a position to do any translating. So I have to rely on other people who know German well and English well and can translate Kant into English. And this particular translation is by Louis Whitebeck. Louis Whitebeck was a prominent student of Kant. I don't mean he studied under Kant. What I mean is he has studied the writings left behind by Kant. Okay, so Louis Whitebeck's life did not overlap with Kant at all. But he studied Kant as well as anybody, and he knows German fluently, and he translated Kant into English. So I'm going to assume that this is a competent translation. I have nothing else to go by than this. Here's what Kant says. There is, therefore, only one categorical imperative. It is, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Notice all of the elements that we've talked about previously are there. The word will, it shows you that that is crucial to Kant's theory. You've got to be able to will something. Secondly, the word maxim, he says, act only according to that maxim. And you now know what that means. It means a subjective principle of volition. And also the words universal law are listed there. And we've talked about that as well. Kant insists that our actions be universalizable. Right? We have to be able to will consistently that the maxims of our actions are universal, that they apply to everyone, everywhere, at all times. In fact, we haven't talked about this, but when you say that something is universal, you're making a very sweeping claim. If I say that something is universally the case, I mean it's the case not just here and now, but everywhere and at all times. If I say that it's universally the case, I mean it was the case 10,000 years ago, that it was the case 100 years ago, that it's the case today, right now, that it will be the case 10 years from now, and 10,000 years from now. Okay, that's what it means to make a universal claim. It's true at all times, past, present, and future. And it also says that it's true everywhere. It's not just true in Arlington, Texas, or in the United States. It's not just true in the Western Hemisphere. It's true everywhere. It's true all over the earth, in every country, in every culture. And if there are other sentient, conscious, rational beings in other parts of the universe, it applies to them too. So when Kant talked about universal laws, he meant it. He meant laws that apply to all rational beings, everywhere and at all times. Okay? Next paragraph. He says, now if all imperatives of duty can be derived from this one imperative as a principle, we can at least show what we understand by the concept of duty and what it means, even though it remain undecided whether that which is called duty is an empty concept or not. Now, I have no comments on that paragraph. I read it just for the sake of completeness. There's no point in trying to analyze it because nothing we go on to say depends on it. So let's just skip over it and go on to the next paragraph. Kant says, the universality of law, according to which effects are produced, constitutes what is properly called nature in the most general sense as to form, i.e., the existence of things so far as it is determined by universal laws. By analogy, then, the universal imperative of duty can be expressed as follows, act as though the maxim of your action were, by your will, to become a universal law of nature. And one of the things that's maddening about Kant is that he says the same thing in many different ways. He has just in 3 short paragraphs given us 2 different formulations of the same principle, the categorical imperative. Above, in the first paragraph, he said, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And now in the 3rd paragraph, just a few sentences later, he says, act as though the maxim of your action were, by your will, to become a universal law of nature. Notice all the words are still there. Maxim is still there, will, and universal law. So he's expressing the same idea in 2 different ways. And philosophers have scratched their heads and wondered, why would he say it in two different ways? Does he think it means the same thing? Maybe. Maybe he's just paraphrasing it. But maybe he means something slightly different by it. That's also a possibility. So you can see why philosophers continue to debate among themselves about exactly what Kant meant when he wrote the words that he wrote. The fourth paragraph, before we get to the four examples, goes like this. We shall now enumerate some duties, adopting the usual division of them into duties to ourselves and to others, and into perfect and imperfect duties. Now, those are the two distinctions that we talked about earlier. Perfect, imperfect on the one hand, duties to self, duties to others on the other hand. Okay, and that's what led to the little 2x2 box diagram or taxonomy that we went over a few minutes ago. Kant is pointing out here that he didn't make these distinctions up. What he's saying is that he calls them the usual division of duties. So Kant is simply borrowing something that has been out there discussed by others. You see what I'm saying? He didn't invent the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties, and he did not invent the distinction between duties to self and duties to others. He's simply making use of it for his own purposes. Okay, here's what we have on the table for today remaining. We're going to read the first numbered paragraph, which is the suicide example, and we're going to discuss it. And then we're going to go to the second example on lying promises. I'm going to read it, and we'll discuss it. And that'll take us up to the end of today's lecture. So let's begin by reading together the paragraph that deals with Kant's first example having to do with suicide. So listen carefully, and then we'll discuss it. And these are Kant's numerals, by the way. He does number these paragraphs. Number 1, a man who is reduced to despair by a series of evils feels a weariness with life, but is still in possession of his reason sufficiently to ask whether it would not be contrary to his duty to himself to take his own life. Now, he asks whether the maxim of his action could become a universal law of nature. His maxim, however, is : Now listen carefully, because Kant sometimes tells us the maxim. We don't have to guess what it is or figure it out. He tells us. Here it is. For love of myself, I make it my principle to shorten my life when by a longer duration it threatens more evil than satisfaction. I'm going to come back and talk about that maxim in a moment, but let's just read the rest of the paragraph. Kant says, but it is questionable whether this principle of self-love could become a universal law of nature. One immediately sees a contradiction in a system of nature whose law would be to destroy life by the feeling whose special office is to impel the improvement of life. In this case, it would not exist as nature. Hence, notice that word is a conclusion indicator. So here's the conclusion. Hence, that maxim cannot obtain as a law of nature. And thus, there's another conclusion indicator, thus. And thus, it wholly contradicts the supreme principle of all duty. Now that's it. That's all Kant says about his first example. A reasonable person would want to know more. If Kant were here and I could question him, I would ask him a lot of questions. I would ask, for example, whether he is opposed to all suicide or only this particular type of suicide, which is motivated out of self-love. So that would be one question I'd like to ask him. He didn't answer that question, so we only have to guess about what he meant. So let's go back and discuss certain features of this example. Notice the situation. We've got a man. It could be a woman, but it happens to be a man. A man is reduced to despair by a series of evils. Now, we don't know what those evils are, but we can fill in some possibilities. Maybe this man has lost his job and he has no prospects for getting a job as good, or maybe even another job at all. Now, that would have a devastating effect on almost anyone, losing your job, because now your source of income is going away. And if you have dependents, children, and other loved ones, you may be unable to provide for them. Another possibility is that his spouse has died or left him, and he's despondent over that. Maybe his children have been injured or even killed in an accident. Maybe he is sick a great deal and not feeling well. So he's reduced to despair by a series of evils. And you can fill in whatever evils you think apply. I've just given you a few possibilities. Because of these evils, he feels a weariness with life. Right? So he's wondering whether his life is any longer worth living. His days are filled with misery rather than joy. He dreads getting up each day because he's going to feel despondent all day and then do it again the following day, and so on. The thought might occur to him that he would be better off dead. Okay, he's despondent. He's suicidal. But notice what Kant says. He is still in possession of his reason sufficiently to ask whether it would not be contrary to his duty to himself to take his own life. In other words, he wants to do the right thing. And he will not commit suicide unless he comes to believe that it's the right thing to do. If he concludes that suicide is wrong, he won't do it because he doesn't want to act wrongly. If, however, he concludes that suicide is permissible, then he may well kill himself to escape the despondency that he feels every day, the despair. Okay, so that's the situation. Now, what is this man's maxim? Remember, the maxim of the act is the subjective principle of it. And so the act is killing oneself or killing himself. The maxim is the principle under which he would be doing so, the subjective principle. And here is how Kant formulates it. For love of myself, I make it my principle to shorten my life, when by a longer duration it threatens more evil than satisfaction. So his principle is, when out of love for myself or out of self-interest, I make it my principle to kill myself when continued living is worse than death because of all the evils that it has in store. Notice the motive is self-love. Now, we don't use that term very often anymore. It was once used by philosophers quite widely. And I think the best way to understand self-love is self-interest. This man is thinking about his own interests. And he said, out of self-interest, I shall kill myself when continuing to live threatens more misery than good, or more misery than happiness. So the motive, which is self-interest, is built into the action. Now, suppose it turns out, as Kant thinks it does, that killing himself for this reason or for this motive is wrong. It does not follow that killing oneself for some other reason is wrong. In other words, Kant may be talking about only a particular kind of suicide motivated by self-interest. In his view, that's wrong. But there are other kinds of suicide that may not be wrong according to Kant. What if you're in a situation where a number of people maybe are on a lifeboat, and the lifeboat will capsize unless someone jumps overboard into the freezing water? Okay? If nobody jumps overboard, all the people on the lifeboat will die. Suppose you take it upon yourself to sacrifice your life for the sake of the others on the lifeboat. You want to give them a chance to live. There may be no guarantee that they will live, but at least they will have a chance. If nobody jumps overboard and sacrifices his or her life, all pretty clearly will perish. Now, what if you jumped overboard to save those others? Is that done out of self-love? No, that's done out of love for others. That's an altruistic suicide. So Kant might well say, in that case, that that suicide is right. It's in accordance with duty. Now, I haven't analyzed it according to Kant's principle. My point is simply this. Just because suicide motivated by self-love turns out to be wrong, according to Kant's theory, it doesn't follow that every suicide is wrong, according to Kant's theory. Maybe altruistic suicides are not wrong. Maybe they're right. Okay, so I just want to make that point. It's a point Feldman makes as well. I'm not going to go find it and read it to you, but Feldman makes the same point. Let's not assume that Kant was against all suicides. What we know is that he's against some suicides, those motivated by self-interest. Okay, now what is Kant's analysis of this example? Here I'm going to turn to this handout, which I prepared for you. It has all of Kant's examples plus the ones from the final section. Let's find this example and read across, from this side over to this side. And you'll see how Kant analyzes this case or this example. Okay, I'm looking at the second row, this one where my finger is. The first row is simply the headings of the diagram or the chart. So follow along with me. If you have not printed this out, pause the video, go to Canvas, print this, and bring it back so that you can follow along as I read this. Okay, now what is the act? Let's try to isolate the act. The act Feldman calls A sub 1. Later we're going to have A sub 2, A sub 3, and so on. So act A sub 1 is described by Feldman on page 107 as the act of suicide the man would commit if he were to commit suicide. In other words, killing himself. Think of that as the act. And this man is wondering whether killing himself is right or wrong. Okay, go over to the next column. What's the maxim of the act? Well, here's how Feldman puts it. We saw Kant's formulation. Here's Feldman, page 107. When continuing to live will bring me more pain than pleasure, I shall commit suicide out of self-love. Okay, that's not exactly how Kant put it, but it's a paraphrase. I hope you agree that it's got all the essentials of Kant's own formulation of the maxim. Okay? What's the next step? We have to generalize the maxim. So that's column 3. The generalized form of the maxim goes like this. Again, this is a quotation from Feldman on 107. Whenever continuing to live will bring anyone more pain than pleasure, we should say he or she, will commit suicide out of self-love. Now that's the easy step, right? It's always easy to generalize the maxim. You just make it applicable to everyone, not just yourself. Okay, here's the first question. This first question comes from this flowchart. Is the generalized form of the maxim of the act, which is column 3, capable of being a universal law? Kant's answer is no. He says, and this is me, Keith, speaking, the state of affairs in question is self-contradictory. Self-love cannot both stimulate the furtherance of life, which is its natural function, and destroy life. Okay? So the answer to the first question is no. We immediately know, where is this, right here? We immediately know that the act is wrong. We don't even need to go to the second question. We don't even need to ask whether the agent can consistently will. that the maxim be a law of nature? Right? That question is moot. Right? We've already determined that the act is wrong because it cannot be a law of nature. The maxim can't be a law of nature. Okay, so let's go to the next column. I said we don't need to continue with this, but let's see what happens if we do. Can the agent consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of the act be a universal law? In other words, is the maxim universalizable? And again, the answer has to be no. Since the state of affairs in question is self-contradictory, which is the previous column, nobody, including the agent, can consistently will it. If something's impossible, you can't consistently will it. Right? Here's an impossibility. Somebody being a married bachelor. Okay, it's impossible, logically, for somebody to be a married bachelor. What makes it impossible? The very concept of a bachelor. The concept of a bachelor has unmarried built into it. So if I asked you to imagine a world with a married bachelor, you would say, there can't be a world like that, by definition of the word bachelor. It would be a contradiction in terms to use the phrase, a married bachelor, or there exists a married bachelor. And because that state of affairs is impossible, nobody can will it. Nobody can consistently will it. Nobody can rationally will it. Any more than somebody could rationally will that there be a married bachelor. Right? All that would show is that this person doesn't understand what a bachelor is. Okay? You cannot consistently will that there be a married bachelor because of the concept of a bachelor. So, what's the final column? The final column gives you the result, or what I'm calling the normative status of the act. Remember, the normative status could be, it's got to be either right or wrong. And if it's right, we could go further and ask whether it's obligatory or merely permissible. So let's just focus on right or wrong for the moment. The act, as I wrote here, the act is wrong. Rational beings, therefore, have a perfect, i.e., negative duty to preserve and respect their rational capacities. The act in question, committing suicide, is contrary to this duty. That's Kant's view. Kant's view, and we'll take this up when we get to chapter 8, Kant's view is that every rational being has a moral duty to preserve and respect his or her rational capacities. And when you kill yourself, you are destroying your life. You are destroying your rational capacities. And that's contrary to your duty to protect and respect your rational capacities. So Kant's view is that this man's act is wrong. Now let's go back and see Kant's analysis of it. These are Kant's words as translated into English. Kant says it's questionable whether this principle of self-love could become a universal law of nature. Why? One immediately sees a contradiction in a system of nature whose law would be to destroy life by the feeling whose special office is to impel the improvement of life. That's it. Kant says there's a contradiction in there. Kant believes, without arguing for this, Kant believes that we are given self-love, right? All of us love ourselves, and the purpose of that self-love is to protect our lives, to preserve our lives. How could there be a system of nature where this one thing, self-love, exists both to protect and preserve our lives and to end our lives? That Kant thinks is a contradiction. Self-love cannot both preserve our lives, and destroy our lives. Now, I have to point out to you, not many philosophers, if any, are persuaded by Kant's reasoning. Feldman himself says this is not very impressive. Right? For example, why can't self-love perform multiple functions? Why does self-love have to have only one function, preserving our lives? Why can't self-love function to preserve our life when things are going well and we're happy, and at the same time function to destroy our lives when we are miserable with no prospect for improvement? Kant doesn't explain that. Kant assumes that self-love can have and does have only one function, namely self-preservation. And when you juxtapose that with self-destruction, Kant says there's a contradiction. But most philosophers don't see any contradiction here. They think Kant simply went too fast and he glossed over a serious problem. Another way to look at it is that Kant is making some assumptions here that are implausible and that need to be defended by argument. The main assumption he makes is that self-love can have only one function or purpose. And he doesn't explain why that has to be. So, that's the first example. What do I want you to take away from it? I want you to understand how Kant analyzes it. And that's why I made this handout for you. It takes it step by step. You start over here with the act and you kind of work your way across until you get the result. I want you also to remember that not all philosophers agree with Kant. Not all philosophers agree that on his own theory, this act of suicide comes out wrong. In fact, some philosophers think that by Kant's own reasoning, this man's suicide is permissible. And many philosophers think that it's a good thing that Kant messed up because suicide in this case isn't wrong. It's actually right, and it's therefore a good thing that Kant failed to show that it's wrong. Well, that's an interesting twist, isn't it? Kant was wrong, and it's a good thing that he was wrong because otherwise he would have reached the wrong result rather than the right result. Okay, time is running short. Let's move on to the second example. I won't have to be so long-winded because some of the things I've already said apply to this example as well. Let's begin by reading it. This one's called the lying promise example. And then we'll pull this handout out and we'll follow along. Okay, Kant wrote the following, paragraph 2. Another man finds himself forced by need to borrow money. He well knows that he will not be able to repay it, but he also sees that nothing will be loaned him if he does not firmly promise to repay it at a certain time. He desires to make such a promise, but he has enough conscience to ask himself whether it is not improper and opposed to duty to relieve his distress in such a way. Okay, that's the basic situation. You've got a man who needs money. He can't think of any way to get the money. He's desperately in need. And then one day it occurs to him, wait a minute, I've borrowed money from people before and they've lent it to me. I will ask someone to lend me money and I will falsely promise to repay it. Why falsely? Because I know I won't be able to repay it. I know right now that I won't be able to repay the money. But if I falsely promise to repay it, the person will give me the money and then I will have the money I need. Okay? The question is, would it be right to do that, to make a false promise or a lying promise? Here's Kant continuing. Now, assuming he does decide to do so, the maxim of his action would be as follows. And I put this in boldface type because this is Kant's own statement of the man's maxim. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, although I know I shall never do so. Okay, the maxim has built into it the fact that it's a lie. Right? It's not just any old act of borrowing money. It's a particular act of borrowing money where the agent knows full well that he or she will not be able to repay the money. So Kant's not asking whether it's right or wrong to make a promise. He's asking whether it's right or wrong to make a lying promise, which is a very narrow category. Now, here's Kant's own analysis of this example. He says, now this principle of self-love or of his own benefit may very well be compatible with his whole future welfare. But the question is whether it is right. He changes the pretension of self-love into a universal law and then puts the question, how would it be if my maxim became a universal law? He immediately sees that it could never hold as a universal law of nature and be consistent with itself. Rather, it must necessarily contradict itself. Now, let me stop right there before I resume. Kant is saying, as he said in example 1, that the generalized form of the maxim cannot be a universal law of nature. And that already makes it wrong. You don't even have to ask whether this agent can consistently will it. So once again, on this diagram, we start out here and we end up right there. No, the maxim cannot be a law of nature, therefore the act is wrong. Okay, let's continue. Kant says, now Kant's going to explain why it can't be a law of nature. He says, for the universality of a law, which says that anyone who believes himself to be in need could promise what he pleased with the intention of not fulfilling it, would make the promise itself and the end to be accomplished by it impossible. No one would believe what was promised to him, but would only laugh at any such assertion as vain pretense. Now, as Feldman and others have pointed out, this is pretty shoddy reasoning by Kant. You may start to wonder why I claimed that Kant was a genius. When you read his arguments in these examples, you may think, this is not a genius, this is somewhat of a dolt. But I insist that he was a genius. He just didn't analyze these examples at great enough length. They're too compressed. Perhaps if he had said more, they would make more sense. But he didn't leave us much to go by. It sounds like he's saying this. It sounds like he's saying, what if this maxim were to be universalized? What if everyone who needed money made a lying promise to get money? You have to imagine a world like that. What would a world like that be like? What if, whenever somebody needed money, he or she made a lying promise? Would there be any promises made in that society or in that world? If everybody made a lying promise all the time, surely the word would get around and everyone would know that every promise was a lying promise, or likely to be so. Would anybody lend anybody any money in return for a promise? I wouldn't. My reasoning would be, people routinely make lying promises. This person is promising me some money next week if I give him money today. I'm no fool. I'm going to laugh and say, who do you think? You think I'm an idiot? You think I'm going to give you money when I know, just as you know, that lying promises are routinely made? So when you try to imagine a world in which everyone makes lying promises, and this man in this example makes a lying promise and gets money from it, you get a contradiction. You can't both make a lying promise and get money and it be in a world where people routinely make lying promises. Everyone would laugh at you if you even made a proposal like that. Now, that's the best I can do to help you understand what Kant was claiming. He claims there's a contradiction in a world where people make lying promises routinely. Many philosophers don't see that. Many philosophers don't think that Kant's reasoning is persuasive. And maybe it's a good thing that Kant's reasoning wasn't persuasive. Maybe it's morally permissible to make a lying promise when you're desperately in need. Wouldn't an act utilitarian say that? An act utilitarian might well conclude, after doing a utility calculation, that more overall good will be done from borrowing the money and putting it to a good use than in not borrowing money. Right? Maybe the person from whom you're borrowing money is rich and won't miss it, but you are in great need and will use the money to provide for your basic necessities. A utilitarian might well say, in a case like that making a lying promise is right. And yet Kant seems to be saying that all lying promises are wrong. Right? So Kant may well be contradicting the act utilitarian, but he may not be correct. The act utilitarian may have the correct conclusion that sometimes making a lying promise is right. At any rate, that's Kant's reasoning, for better or worse. Some philosophers think that it's slipshod and not very persuasive, but I want you to understand the nature of his example and the reasoning that he engages in. The final thing I want to do is go over this handout for this example. Now this one bleeds over from page 1 to page 2, so I'm going to have to keep flipping it. What is the act in question? Feldman calls it A sub 2, and he describes it as borrowing money on a false promise. And that's pretty close to the act that Kant described. What's the maxim of that act? When I need money and can get some by borrowing it on a false promise, then I shall borrow the money and promise to repay, even though I know that I won't be able to repay. Again, it's pretty close to Kant's own statement of the maxim. What's the generalized form of the maxim? Whenever anyone needs money, blah, blah, blah. My voice is giving out. I won't even bother reading the rest of it. Is the generalized form of the maxim of the act capable of being a universal law? Kant's answer, no. The state of affairs in question is self-contradictory. Everybody in need would borrow money on a false promise, and because this would be known to all, nobody in need could borrow money on a false promise. So everybody would be trying to borrow money on a false promise, and no one would be able to. According to Kant, that is self-contradictory. And that's why it can't be a universal law of nature. Okay? Next question, can the agent consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim be a universal law of nature? Actually, we don't need to ask that second question, but the answer, of course, is no. If it can't be a law of nature, then you can't consistently will that it be a law of nature. And so what's the normative status of the act? Once again, the act comes out as wrong. Rational beings, according to Kant, have a perfect, i.e. negative duty to respect others. The act in question, borrowing money on a false promise, is contrary to this duty. Kant points out that failure to respect others is a vice, right? As in virtue and vice. So there you have it. We've gone over the first two of the four examples. We've arrived at the same conclusion for both of them. The act in question is wrong or contrary to duty. Is Kant's reasoning leading up to that answer persuasive? Arguably not. But that's not the most important thing. I want you to understand how Kant reasons and not whether he reasons well or poorly. I want you to understand the structure of his reasoning. Okay, let's finish up this chapter, or yes, let's finish up chapter 7 on Thursday this week, and we'll go over examples 3 and 4, and we'll look at another couple of examples from the final section of the chapter. So make sure you read that final section by Thursday. Okay, enough for today. We're exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes in, which is the normal length of a lecture. So have a great day and tomorrow, and I'll see you in a couple of days.